I am pleased to see how Dublin has produced quite a lot of people who are interested in what is going on in Japan today. It's a subject that is almost entirely ignored in the rest of the world, which is rather amazing, because what is happening in Japan today is of great interest, and I think will be of great interest in future, not only for Japan, but certainly for the region, East Asian region, and I think for the rest of the world. Now, it's a complex subject. Japanese political system is a conceptual challenge to understand it. It's taken me a long time, and sometimes I wonder whether I really fathomed how it works. I think I have the illusion that I do a little bit, I know a little bit about it. We only have a relatively short time. I think I speak about 40 minutes or so, and then I'm very interested to hear your questions. It's the part of an event that I enjoy most. But nevertheless, it's only 40 minutes, and the subject deserves, of course, a much longer time. But to approach it, I think that I should tell two stories. It's two stories. They're interwoven, and if you don't understand one, you can't really understand the other. One is the domestic political story, and the other one is a story of international relations, especially of the trans-Pacific relationship, Japan and the United States. I think that because you're interested in international relations and your institute is really based on that, on the idea that people should understand international relations better, I begin there. And there we have a trans-Pacific relationship that is truly unique in history. If you can find for me another case like it, I'd be very happy if you tell me, because I have not found any analogical situation to that of Japan and the United States. The United States is the world's foremost industrial power. Japan has been number 2 for a very long time now. And at some point, there were people who believed that Japan would bypass the United States. So industrially, they're on a par. Japan, of course, was defeated in the Pacific War in 1945, and that created, of course, a basis for a special relationship. But then it continued in a way that was very different from how the political heavyweights in 1945 in Japan had envisioned what the future might bring. But Japan, until very recently, until now, Japan was not so much an ally of the United States. It was treated by Washington as a protectorate, and it's still being treated as a protectorate. Although it's not quite the same as a protectorate, but again, there is no generally accepted term that describes the reality of it. But Japan is very much a vassal state, has been, of the United States. The circumstances that came with that relationship were quite profitable for Japanese planners in the 50s and the 60s and even the 70s, because they could devote all their attention to economic expansion, to becoming an economic power. So in 1945, there was a return to a situation that had existed in the early part of the 20th century, after the Russo-Japanese War, when you had two groups of policy thinkers in Japan. One said Japan should be a major power in the world through conquest and through having colonies, the way the Europeans used to do it. And the other group said, no, no, let's not do this, let's just make our mark on the world economically. Now, in 1945, of course, that choice no longer existed, and therefore the other the other project of becoming a major economic power in the world was the obvious choice. And it was wonderful because Japan could do a lot of things, as it were, shielded from geopolitical ups and downs, especially in the region, especially considering, you know, the major changes in China turning communist, especially because you had the biggest neighbor, of course, is Russia. That's a neighbor of Japan. It was wonderful for the government, the planners, for everybody in Japan, to rest under the wings, as it were, of the Trans-Pacific Eagle. And they made the most of it. I think that there has rarely been a story of industrial expansion that matches. I don't think, there's no story at all that matches what Japan did and pioneered in doing in the 50s, the 60s, and the 70s. All the time, Japan wasn't there on the map politically. It was described by foreign heads of state and by many commentators as an economic giant and a political dwarf. It did cause some friction because if you are that strong economically and if you have the power to wipe out industries in other parts of the world, that of course is a political given, it's a political fact. And it causes friction and it causes problems that require political measures to deal with. So Japan wasn't there in the eyes of people who tried to knock on the door, and there was nobody ever there. I remember Henry Kissinger passing by Tokyo. He didn't really like that so much because in China, in Beijing, he could talk with, he could actually see and touch the people in power. And in Japan, he was saying all the time, "Take me to your leader." And there didn't seem to be anyone. So diplomatically and politically, Japan did not exist in the world, or hardly existed. It was usually there if some idealistic project that didn't have any bearing on any consequences for domestic political relationships, then Japan would cooperate, fine, no problem at all. But whenever there was something needed that required a readjustment politically at home, you could not really find people to talk with in Japan. So Japan didn't have a government in the normal sense of the word that people were used to. This was, people felt comfortable in this way. It was odd, it was strange, but the rest of the world got used to it. Japan really did not participate in an international political game. This has gone on for a very long time. And today we are seeing the first changes. Because today we see a new government put together by a party that is relatively young. Actually, it's not that young, but I'll go into this in a minute. But it's only recently become a party that people had to count with. And this new government has actually said, we want to be a factor on the world stage. We want to be more active. We want to do something in the region. The early initiatives are to improve relations with China. And indeed, they're of course also thinking about better relations with Russia and Southeast Asia in general. There's this notion of an ASEAN +3, for which Beijing is most enthusiastic, but also the ASEAN countries. And Japan, until very recently, was the most reluctant entity in this +3. It's, of course, the +3 was Korea, Japan and China, ASEAN plus 3. But today, that has changed. Also, the thinking around that has changed. Now, the problem is that Washington isn't really happy with these changes, isn't really happy with this new way of looking at the world by a government that has just come in. And I will come to this in a moment because it becomes a very important part of the story. To take the domestic political story at this point, you must realize that even before this status of being a vassal of the United States, which meant that all those things by which a state is externally recognized were looked after by American proxy, as it were. All those things that counted. The United States would take care not only of Japan's defense, Japan's strategic interests in general, but even of its economic strategic interests. It would sort of help Japan exist in a world where the international arrangement to help stimulate free exchanges, free trade, free exchanges of economic activity, had helped Japan a great deal. And Japan didn't have to do all that much to secure those. In other words, Japan didn't need a central government that could be a center of political accountability. That is how I have formulated what I consider a fundamental problem with the Japanese political system. It's only a problem in an international context. Although, of course, it can be also domestically a problem if you need political measures to cope with social or economic problems that have begun to take on a political coloring. You need some center to be able to decide and to actually carry out the decisions made in order to cope with the situation. This is notoriously lacking in Japan. There are still people today who compare wartime Japan with wartime Germany. And of course, wartime Germany, you had a strong leader. There was no question about where the center of power existed in Hitlerite Germany. But in Japan, it was, of course, ridiculous to compare Tojo with Hitler. He never came close to occupying that kind of position. In fact, you can argue, and some historians in Japan have argued, that World War II was essentially the result of an attempt to solve the differences between the Imperial Army and the Navy. This is too much history to go into here, and of course these things are controversial. But you can say that what began the Pacific War, what began the Japanese military activities in the region, essentially was a series of events caused by insubordinate officers and nothing coming out of Tokyo as such. All right? So the Tokyo authorities were not listened to by the military authorities in the field. This is something to keep in mind because there are other countries where this sort of thing is happening or is about to happen. So you had a history that is very unusual, as we all know, because of Japan's isolation. During those 2.5 centuries of Japanese isolation, cyclical, you needed not have a center of diplomatic activity in Edo to deal with the rest of the world. It was not necessary. What you began to have at the end of the 19th and the beginning of the 20th century was an oligarchy that had created one of the most interesting revolutions from above, the Meiji Revolution, Restoration it's called, but actually it was a coup d'etat that was followed by a revolution. It's again a very interesting history that contains more lessons for us than is generally recognized. But that oligarchy did not replicate itself, and it sort of disintegrated in various groups, various factions, if you want to call it, power centers, that each had their own plans, that each had their own way of thinking about Japan's well-being and what it should be doing. The military were very important. Two military factions were very important in this scheme of things. And the Ministry of Finance, which was another important entity, of course, was scared of them. And when the Army and the Navy went to the Ministry of Finance with their hands held out, the Ministry of Finance could only give in to their demands. This is a very interesting part of the story, because it is the beginning of a system that has the potential to go berserk. There's no longer any kind of control that can keep it from doing things that are in the long run counterproductive and certainly disadvantageous for itself. This is a situation that is built on a history that never saw an undisputed central leader. You had a shogun in Edo, and you had the daimyo that were, who were bosses of their provinces, and they had an interesting relationship to the shogun because they were obliged to be hostage for half the year in Edo. If something happened in the provinces that challenged central rule, the hostages, of course, would prevent this from going too far, because the daimyo families would not have survived that. It meant that a fundamental problem of all countries, of all states, of who has the right to rule, in other words, political legitimacy, never developed. This development of political central rule, the political legitimacy, in Japan was arrested at some point. And the oligarchy, the Meiji oligarchy, didn't solve it, because they did not institute mechanisms to ensure a succession of relatively central governance. And that is what caused the problem, I think, of Japan in the early part of the 20th century, when you could have insubordinate officers, essentially army officers, because the Navy knew very well that in a war Japan would lose. The Navy knew this because the boats had been all over the world and had seen the kind of power that they would have to face. But the army was a hotbed of highly nationalistic, arrogant, and very unrealistic power holders. After World War II, there should, of course, have been an attempt to create that center of political accountability, so as to ensure that the system would never be derailed again. And this has become a very interesting story, because a lot of what could go wrong was understood by Japanese thinkers and by Japanese people in responsible positions in the political system. It was understood that it could go wrong. And so that political system devised a lot of interesting mechanisms to avoid that ever from happening again. And this is an interesting thing to study, and it's hardly been studied by anybody, but it is very interesting, I think, also for power systems in the rest of the world to understand what kind of mechanisms can exist to make sure that excess does not grow into uncontrolled excess that will undermine your long-term interests. Now, we have a Japanese political system. I've called it a system so as to distinguish it from a state. You see, there are many different definitions of states, but the one thing that they have in common is they assume a center of political accountability. Of course, the analogy is the human body, a brain. You have to be able, if you have a state, there is a point where you can address the state, where you can appeal to the state, when you can try to make the state see what is in its long-term interest. That is what I call a center of political accountability. And after World War II, Japan was not only not encouraged creating one, no, it was discouraged from creating that because of that strange relationship with the United States. A relationship in which the various bureaucratic bodies in Japan that could not talk with each other because of their history were talking to each other via the American bodies that corresponded with the Japanese. So this is the Japanese occupation. You had foreign ministry entities that had become very friendly with State Department entities and that were addressing the problematic entities that, of course, had to do with strategy, with defense, etc., through Washington, not directly. It's a very interesting part that also many Japanese have insufficiently studied. Japanese historians are interested in parts of the story, and some of them, of course, have. I haven't invented all this. I mean, I read this also from Japanese historians, but it hasn't been common knowledge, shall we say, that the importance of the United States in encouraging political discussions in Tokyo. So you never had a movement in Japan, except in the very beginning with Kishi and even, I think, under Ikeda. But under Sato, Prime Minister Sato, things went so well under the conditions that had been created by the United States and an agreement with between the bigwigs in Tokyo that, of course, had come mostly from bureaucratic entities, but worked themselves up to political position. So that what you called in Japan was a political system that in reality hardly resembled what it was on paper. What I'm describing, of course, had no correspondence to any constitutional rules. It didn't have it did not reflect what was supposed to be true in a legal sense in Japan. Okay, so we have here something that is known in other parts of the world. You have an official system, political system, and then you have a real system. It's sort of, the real system hides in this official system, and if you know your way around it, you're fine. All countries have this. But in Japan, the informal system of power is, as it were, institutionalized to a point where there need not be any connection whatsoever, and you can't appeal, or it's very difficult to appeal to what should be, because few people around you would understand what you're talking about. It'd be very difficult to use that as a political weapon. Although it has happened, it is done, and sometimes also successfully, but it is not something that is done in any routine fashion. So you have even a way of talking about this. You have an official system, the way things are supposed to be, the way things the way in which most people, most teachers teach their school children, of course, how things are. And that is known as the tatamai reality. You have this dichotomy in Japan, tatamai and hone. Tatamai is the official reality, hone is the true reality, the substantial reality. Tatamai is a principle, and hone is the reality. Tatamai is what you pretend, and hone is the real you. This dichotomy is used in general daily life in Japan. And interestingly, if you talk, for example, to one group of people active in an area, say education, and you you talk about the tatema and hana, they immediately know what you're talking about. I mean, this is a very useful dichotomy, because immediately you can address the kind of things that people in Japan are expected to be disingenuous about, and are, by being disingenuous about them, are actually doing the right thing. It's doing the socially desirable thing. And it's interesting then to discover that, say, I was talking about the teachers, that they are surprised that in other areas of life there's also this tatema and hone difference. That, you know, it's really true that among politicians, same thing. Yeah, same thing. It's institutionalized, that informal system. And it is so strong, and it has so many mechanisms to ensure its survival, that anybody who comes around and says, we want to change Japan into what it is supposed to be according to our constitution, and according to the rules that we have all agreed on, that person or group of people who decides to do that runs into a major problem, as you can understand. The biggest challenge to this unofficial political power system, the very biggest challenge that I have witnessed, and I've been in Japan since 1962, is the election and the formation of a Minshito. Minshito is the Democratic Party of Japan. I like to refer to it as Minshito because it's more closely, you know, it covers what it is, whereas the Democratic Party of Japan, you'd think a matter of democracy and all. The Minshito is the biggest challenge to this informal system that Japan has experienced in peacetime. And you can imagine what this means. When in early 2008, I returned to Japan after the longest absence ever since '62, since the first time I got there. I'd only been in 2007. I'd only been in Japan for a couple of weeks, not by any design, but just it happened to be that way. And when I returned in January of 2008, and I was talking with Japanese friends and Japanese journalists, etc., they were excited because they said, "Well, you know, this year we're going to have really a big change, as we're going to have an election that is going to change the political map of Japan. Well, you'll have we're going to get a real government with Ozawa leading it." And I said to them, "But what about the scandals that will bring Ozawa down?" Because that was very predictable. You see, the informal power system makes sure that excess, in the eyes of the people that count, in the eyes of it's also is in sort of what is generally understood to be the case, that excess is countered by scandals. Japanese scandals are very difficult to understand for outsiders because they are usually about things that are normally considered normal, except not to the degree that they happen, except not if they affect too many people. So scandals exist to make sure that excess doesn't go too excessive, and it saves the system in this way. I give you many examples of this, and I've written about it at length, also for books that were only meant for Japanese readership. And it was predictable that Ozawa was going to be brought down by the public prosecutor, because you have a scandal when the public prosecutor joins with the media, with especially the big newspapers. They decide to bring a particular politician who is too big for his boots, to cut him down to size. This happened with Tanaka Kakue, for example. It happens when an entrepreneur goes too far in creating a business that seems to threaten social stability, as happened with Eizo Hiromasa and the recruit scandal, which was in fact an attempt to create a labor market for salarymen, which would have destroyed the way, or not destroyed, but severely undermined the way in which Japanese salarymen are attached to their corporations. They can't really change their corporations after they've worked for them for, say, 2 or 3 years. It's still possible, but then after that it's no longer possible if they want to continue having the kind of level pensions and everything that they count on. And Eizo was creating, he started with, it's an interesting, just to go into a little detail, by publishing a lot of magazines for part-time jobs. He branched out into much more than part-time jobs, and he began to create labor market. Couldn't happen. I give you many, many other cases, but we won't have time for that. So what happens when there is a threat that the Minshito may take over from the LDP is that the informal system, in the shape of the public prosecutor, who is at the pinnacle of informal power there, together with the newspapers, whose senior editors are essentially in bed with the senior bureaucrats. They have the same outlook over what is good for Japan. And they are concerned, essentially, they're concerned about public order. My lunches with senior editors and senior bureaucrats, and I've known many over the years, when they turn around the question of who should run Japan. Should it have a cabinet-centered government in which the ministers actually formulate policy and actually formulate how the budget should be divided and what the priorities of Japan should be? These conversations used to come down to the worry that they shared that you couldn't really trust these politicians. You couldn't entrust them with the harmony of the country, with the stability of society, because they had no experience. Of course, if you don't give them a chance to do it, obviously they have no experience. But what I am trying to say is that senior newspaper editors who create political reality in Japan, because they generally write the same thing in their editorials, and they generally select those stories that conform to what they think things people ought to know, and they tell the public what public opinion is. So they create political reality, together with those at the top of the power system, informal power system, the public prosecutors. You could predict that the Minshito government would have a very hard time. Let's look at Minshito at the moment and what they're trying to do. If they succeed in what they say they want to do, this will be nothing short of revolutionary. What do they want to do? They want to have something that Japan has never had. A cabinet-centered, genuine government. Where political decisions can be made with an eye to longer term notions of what is good for the country. In the 60s, or in the late 40s, after the war, and when things had sort of calmed down, and in the early 50s, there was a general decision that Japan should become strong again. It should never be caught again with its pants down, as it were, and it could be done only by industrial expansion. But in a peculiar way, the expansion of productive ability. That was really the decision that was made. That has been Japan's national policy, expansion of productive capacity without regard to profitability. This is a very important point to understand. And essentially, the whole informal system, with the Ministry of Finance, of course, is a very pivotal position, has been geared to accomplishing that goal. And what you see in the way of changes in policies usually serve to make sure that that direction that Japan is going can be maintained. You can compare it to the little engines of a rocket that will correct the rocket's course if it threatens to go off course. Those are Japan's decisions. They are not political decisions, they are administrative decisions. And Japan has the world's most effective administrative decision-making system. There's no question in my mind about that. And other countries in Asia have tried to emulate it, and some of them, like Korea, have been most successful in doing so. They actually copied, literally copied some of these elements. I know that because I knew the Koreans who were doing it at the time, in the 50s and the 60s. Well, not in the 50s, I wasn't there, but in the 60s and the 70s. So, you have a system that is capable of very intricate administrative decisions, allowing Japan to weather storms, to weather international economic crises, etc. But it cannot plot a new political course. And many people have long decided this is necessary for Japan, because things got into a rut. It's far more prosperous than most people realize. And this talk about a lost decade, I think, is absolute nonsense. Because in a decade where that is supposed to be economically lost, you do not rebuild the capital. Tokyo has been rebuilt in the last 15 years. I'm sort of have to calculate again how many years, but and so has Osaka. If you know Tokyo, but you haven't been there for 5 or 6 years, you won't recognize the landmarks are gone. You can no longer orient yourself moving around the city. It's been rebuilt. That's not a lost decade. That's another story, by the way, a very interesting story, that the world's media have completely wrong. But the world's media have been rather bad on the whole, partly because there are hardly any foreign correspondents left in Tokyo. They've all been withdrawn and sent to China, if they're mostly American anyway. And the American correspondents are forced to write about the countries they are in a way that the editors like to see a copy. I mean, I know this from experience. I have many American correspondent friends, so I can I speak from experience. Today, we have in Tokyo, maybe the New York Times, sometimes today, has a story that in some ways is accurate about what the Minchito is trying to do and what it might be able to accomplish. That's it. The Washington Post is terrible because it is writing news about Japan. There's nobody in Japan. There's a correspondent who's sort of traveling around the area, and I think he's based in Seoul. But they are writing about Japan on the basis of what the officials in Washington tell them what's going on in Japan. And the officials in Washington that deal with Japan are, except I think for 1 or 2 that I can identify, all alumni of the Pentagon. And how does Washington respond to these changes in Tokyo? You'll never believe this. I mean, here we have this very strange relationship of dependency, interdependency, because without Japan's help, the dollar would have ceased to be an international reserve currency. This is another long story, but of course they couldn't do it on their own, the Japanese, and the Chinese have joined. For the last 10 years it's been together, the Chinese and Japanese, buying American treasury paper. But not only that, it is Japanese-owned dollars that circulate in the American economy. Because if you repatriate that money, the yen would go through the roof. And that, of course, has been a problem, the upward pressure on the yen because of the effects of the most successful generation of international traders was Japanese. And for decades, they have accumulated huge amounts of dollars. They circulate in the American economy, keep the American economy, or help to keep the American economy going. If all that would change, you know, that would be disastrous for the United States. You have a country that has normally done, almost always done, what Washington asked it to do, and it gets a new government. And the new government says, we really want to make a change, we really want to become an actor on the world stage, politically speaking, diplomatically speaking, and it also means we want to be more independent. This is what Aoyama immediately said. And what does Washington do? It continues to have Pentagon alumni determine policy towards Japan. So Hillary Clinton is, of course, not a Pentagon alumni, but she came in the late spring or early summer, she came to Japan, and she already understood that there would be a different government. And she said, no matter what kind of government you're going to have, you're still going to do what we have agreed on about those marine bases in Okinawa. Now, here today, this marine bases in Okinawa are the pivot around which Japan-American relations revolve today. And the media in Washington are telling the correspondents and the editors the Japanese don't know what's good for them. They have this inexperienced government. Of course they do. I mean, if you've never tried to do what, to have a government, you are by definition inexperienced. And they don't know what they want. Aha, they know very well what they want. They understand what they want. But we have a problem because they're not grateful. We've always sort of formed the defensive, the shield, the defense against Russia and China and whatever. And the picture they paint is of an ungrateful Japan that wants to change things, that wants to change the treaty, which is essentially a base lease agreement between the United States and Japan. That was another piece of history that was, of course, a bone of contention in the early 60s. We have a prime minister of a new government of a very important country in Asia that has been absolutely, crucially important to the United States, who wants to meet with Obama personally. He tries this at several moments. He is rebuffed at the Washington side, but in a way you would hardly believe possible. The approaches are made diplomatically, but the answers come in press conferences by minor officials, but all interested in defense, and saying that if Hatayama wants to solve a problem in his own cabinet, he should not waste the time of our new president. Obama is in Copenhagen for the global warming stuff, the environmental stuff. And Hatayama, of course, is going to be there too. And again, he tries to see Obama there. Again, rebuffed in a press conference. No, we won't have time for this. But Hatayama is given at a dinner, at a banquet, he's given a place to sit next to Hillary Clinton. And they talk. He comes out of the dinner. The Japanese media all get around him and he says, have you discussed the marine base issue in Okinawa? Of course, that's all they can write about. And Hatayama said, of course, we did. Well, what's the result? Well, what he then says is what all Japanese prime ministers or all Japanese politicians would say under any circumstances. There was sort of a positive response. They cannot say, hey, we didn't get anywhere. Subsequently, the Japanese ambassador in Washington is called to Foggy Bottom in Washington to the State Department. It's snowing, and so you have the Japanese media outside in the snow shivering, and they're waiting for their ambassador to come down. And he is told by Hillary Clinton that that was a lie. We did not speak positively about the future of this thing. We have an agreement and we have to carry this out. What is this agreement about? Well, the agreement was something that had been decided upon, a move of a marine base in Okinawa. This is the southernmost group of islands. And it was that plan was never put into practice by the LDP government, which which was defeated in the election that brought Mengistu to power, because it's not viable. It cannot be done. It's politically impossible without causing riots and an uprising in Okinawa. If the Mengistu government would go ahead and do what is in the official plans, then that government would fall because it could not contain the unrest in Okinawa. A solution has to be found. And of course, many Japanese, the senior Japanese political figures thought that at some point Washington will relent and sort of give this a rest, because there are so many other things to discuss, so many other things to talk about. I mean, there are openings to China that have never been seen before. Ozawa, who is the Secretary General of the party, has flown with 2 plane loads of people, but especially ordinary people and artists, writers, etc., for people-to-people and party-to-party contacts in China. They're breaking open that particular side. And there are other things that are happening that Washington and Tokyo ought to be discussing with each other. All they're discussing is moving a military base according to a plan that is not politically viable. At the moment, we're in a situation, it's very interesting because Hatoyama has sort of given the, I'm sort of talking too much, I think, here. So I'm a little bit stuttering and a bit jumping from one to the other because I don't have enough time to give this story the full, the full explanation it requires. We have an American government that actually would like to go back to how things were before, with an LDP that doesn't really govern, except in a very peculiar way that takes too long to explain. The LDP no longer exists. I mean, it's splintered, it's gone, it's finished. It could not, in an election, you wouldn't have an LDP versus Minsto anymore, because that party no longer exists. You can't go back to that. What would happen if this government fell, and if other elections would take place, is a different story. That might even create a worse situation than you had before, but that's, again, another story. What we have is a Minsto government that's beleaguered from the outside by a Washington that actually would like to see it fall, and from the inside by a public prosecutor that can't relent. Cannot relent and wants to, the moment that the Ozawa problem, supposedly the problem, was solved, they turned their attention to the next person who, by becoming president of the party, would become the prime minister, is Hatoyama. And they found something on Hatoyama. You see, the public prosecutor can find something against anyone, including us, if we have lived any time in Japan. Because we have all done something that we didn't know was wrong, but they decide, okay, this was wrong. But politicians is wonderful because of this, the laws governing political donations. They are full of loopholes, and politicians do what they can get away with normally, understandably so, because it costs fortunes to get elected and re-elected. Of course they do what they can get away with, and all of a sudden, when they become prominent and stick out their heads and want to do something, the public prosecutor grabs them to kick them down. And the newspapers help in this respect. And the senior editors of the newspapers, and NHK, for example, NHK is the Japanese BBC type broadcasting, they go along with this because they're so used of flooring Japanese government. The last 3 Japanese governments under the LDP, which was dying, of course, a slow death, were brought down every year. You had musical chairs of prime ministers. And the main people, the main entities that were creating this situation were the newspapers. So it's habit forming. And they are trying to do the same thing that they are so used to doing. All the time, all the while, and this is the interesting thing, and I talk with them so I know what they think, all the while, some of these senior people are very aware of what is going on and what the Minsto is trying to do. They ask me, how long do you think Minsto needs to stay in the saddle in order to achieve what we all want? And they say, in the Meiji Restoration, it took them so long. They don't have this long. And we discuss about the differences between the Meiji Restoration and today. These are not stupid people. They're people who understand very well long-term interest in this. Nevertheless, when it comes down to the nitty-gritty, there are very few politically courageous editors who say, look, let's cut this nonsense. And let us explain how things are the way we know they are. And this is, again, this is your problem if you are used to living in a tatama and Honor world. For such a long time, you can lose your way, and you, at this moment, you don't have a sufficiently large group of Japanese thinkers, Japanese editors, that can tell the public what this whole thing is all about. Now, I've had to simplify. I've been looking at this watch I borrowed to make sure that I did not talk. But now I think I've gone way over the limit, right? So, needless to say, your questions or your disagreements, very, very welcome.
Well, thank you very much.